What are your views with regards to the concept of a software architect? And do you still view it as a useful role? And do you think its functions should kind of devolve to the development team?
So I'm a big fan of teams having a software architecture role as a dedicated thing that they think about and talk about. And for me, it's really an explicit technical leadership role. You can spread the architecture role out amongst the team. There are many instances of that being successful. The problem with doing this is if you have an inexperienced team who are a bit chaotic and they don't really know what they're doing, distributing the responsibility often results in a situation where nobody actually takes responsibilities. That's the kind of thing to watch out for. So as a counter to this, it often makes sense for one or maybe two people to be explicitly labelled as a software architect. And essentially, there's one or two people or whatever, they do the technical leadership on the team. And I think, regardless of all of the agile stuff that's happened over the past few years, the role of software architecture is still as vital, perhaps more so, because we're now moving much, much quicker, of course, and we've got lots more stuff like microservices to worry about. But the software architecture role is incredibly valuable today in the same way it was years ago. It's just that we might approach it in a slightly different way.
Kind of link into that, how much knowledge do you think developers should have of, say, architectural styles, architectural patterns within a development team?
In terms of how much knowledge developers should have about architectural styles and patterns, if I look back through my own career, so when I started my own career, coming out of university, didn't really know too much about how software is built in the real world. And it's one of those things you have to read books and go to conference talks, and it's one of those things you kind of pick up as you progress and as you get more experience. So if I'm on a team as like a super junior person, although I might not need to know all of the different types of architectural styles that are out there, I should definitely understand the one or two that the team have chosen and adopted and are hopefully trying to use in a consistent way on this team, on this project. And then as you get more towards designing software rather than just being kind of told what to do because you're quite junior, as you are trying to expand your career and gain more experience, then you should go and do more research on different architectural styles and patterns and things that could be used in the future. So there's a relationship to experience, essentially, I think.
This is a question from Jim. So not too long ago, there was a lot of work in the software modeling area with tools like rational rows and UML. Agile moved software design from formalized processes and tools, and use of UML moved to more of like a sketch view. Do you think that the move away has gone too far, and it may be kind of appropriate now for like some of these tools and processes in this agile era that we find ourselves in?
So in terms of modelling, so if you look at what happened in kind of the mid to late 90s, which is when I graduated and started my first kind of professional programming job, we used to use exactly tools like rational rows, and we used to do lots of UML modelling at high level, low level, and that's how we used to describe and communicate what we were doing. You get to 2001, the whole agile thing kind of explodes, and in throwing away big upfront design, which is a bad thing, in throwing away big upfront design, a lot of teams coupled to that tools like rational rows, documentation, modelling, and just visual communication through architecture diagrams, for example. And that's exactly why a lot of teams now, they do UML as a sketch. They might use some odd tools like plant UML to create the odd UML type diagram, potentially. And a lot of the advice you see these days is basically, if you want to draw an architecture diagram or communicate your ideas, just use a whiteboard. And the problem with this is there's no rigor there. So this is basically why I've been doing what I've been doing over the past, 10 years. So I have a diagramming technique called the C4 model. And it's an abstraction-led approach. So it's a notation-independent, abstract-led approach to diagramming and thinking about software architecture. And essentially the output is a set of nice, hopefully quite straightforward, simple, hierarchical diagrams that you can use to tell different stories to different audiences. Some non-technical, some very technical. And I'm seeing a lot of organizations where they don't have any existing documentation about their systems. You ask everybody to draw an architecture diagram, you get like 50 different versions. They're all just crazy messes of boxes and lines, and again, there's no rigor. So in answer to your question, yes, this definitely needs to come back. We definitely need to get better at communicating architecture, thinking about architecture, diagramming architecture. I want to get people back to doing modeling as well. And I'm not necessarily talking about using tools like rational rows and doing model-driven engineering and model-based architecture and all that sort of stuff, but I think there's a lot of opportunities here for doing some lightweight modeling. And again, what I see a lot of teams doing is I take my C4 approach, and specifically the abstractions that underlie the C4 diagrams, and they use that as a way to model their systems. And specifically now you can start to look at the relationship between diagrams and code and make sure all of this stuff syncs up. So yes, modeling, diagramming definitely needs to come back in some form.
It's interesting you mentioned about the kind of synchronicity, because often the documentation might fall out of step with the actual implementation, and then it's keeping that in check.
Right.
But that sounds like a great idea. This nicely links into the next question, which is for people who have recently joined a software project. There's often a difficulty for them, especially in large enterprises, being able to see what's there in what's available in, say, like the enterprise, and to actually absorb, say, the complex architectural landscape that's before them. What do you think is the best way to mitigate this?
This is literally the same answer as the previous question. So the answer to this is have some way to visualize and therefore communicate the architectural landscape. And of course you've got multiple levels. So if you go into any large organization, you might be assigned into a team and your team is building something. So you need some description of that thing you're building. So some architecture documentation, some diagrams to a level of detail which you choose, of course. But it's also worth having a slightly broader and high-level view of the world. So this is kind of where you get into the enterprise architecture space. I don't specifically really talk about enterprise architecture because it's something very different to what I normally talk about, which is software architecture. But even if you look at enterprise architecture from a purely technology perspective, it's still worth having a map of systems, system ownership, data ownership, and the relationships between systems, so building up a larger context of where your thing sits into the bigger, wider landscape. And often, by having that, you understand what it is you're building and where it fits into the organizational boundaries, and also why your thing is doing the stuff it's doing. So yeah, diagrams again.
Yeah, I don't think it's seeing it in context.
Yeah, right.
It makes you see the bigger picture. Because often, especially for your microservices, you're attention in a small space. It's about how does that fit into the wider context. So
yes. Yeah, it's about not getting siloed into just the thing that you're looking at.
Yeah. So where do you think the main limitations lie when you're trying to implement an upfront design?
The main limitations around upfront design, this is going to sound a weird answer, but it's really in people's minds. So again, if you go back to 2001 and the whole Agile Manifesto being created, we were doing big upfront design, and we were analysing everything to death and creating solutions for everything, right down to class and almost test level. Write me a list of tests that you're going to use. We threw all that away, which is good, but a lot of people replace it with nothing. And it's this point people say, hang on a second, that's not true. I literally have seen organisations who have admitted to me that they don't do any upfront design because they are agile, in air quotes. And that's the biggest limitation. So I've met some teams recently, and they've literally asked me at the start of my workshop, you're going to talk about upfront design and doing some amount of upfront design. How does this fit into the way that we work, because we are agile? And also, are we allowed to do upfront design if we are doing agile stuff? And that's the biggest limitation. It's really a mindset thing. It's like, if you need to do upfront design, and there are many benefits for doing upfront design, correct starting point, set a direction, etc., then do upfront design. And that's the limitation. It's a mindset thing.
That's good. Just one last question, which is kind of, when did you first come across software craftsmanship?
When did I first come across software craftsmanship? I don't actually know. I get to visit lots of conferences. I've known Sandro for a number of years, so I imagine it was some combination of all of that stuff coming together.
Cool. And where do you see software craftsmanship going in say the future, in say the next 10 years or so?
Again, I'm going to give you an answer that's maybe a bit controversial, given where we are today. I hope that software craftsmanship disappears. And it's not that I don't think that this is important. I think this is super important. and Bob outlines the reasons why it's important. It's about being professional, having pride, and doing the best job we can do. And I think that's exactly what we need to do. We need to be much more disciplined, much more rigorous, much more professional. I just want this to fade into the background and it be what everybody does naturally. So all of the software craftsmanship stuff needs to happen and needs to exist, but the movement, I'd be quite happy if that disappears because it's just what we do naturally. Same with the Agile thing.
Your talk discusses the model code kind of gap. What inspired you to give this talk?
So I've been a big fan of software architecture for a number of years, and I've also been a big fan of writing code and making sure the code I write is as good as it can be from a structural perspective. So I've been a big fan of design and modularity and all of that kind of good stuff that goes around it. And really this talk, the model code gap, is about talking about both angles. So from a kind of top-down holistic architecture point of view, you have a bunch of diagrams that show things. You want these things to make sense. So you want to get to a good design, a good decomposition, one that works, a nice, well-structured, highly modular architecture. From a bottom-up perspective, you need to make sure your code matches that. Otherwise, you get architecture diagrams that don't match the code, you get messy code bases, big balls of mud, and so on and so forth. So the reason I want to do this talk is to join these two worlds together, because you go to architecture conferences, not that there are many of course, but you go to architecture conferences and it's all very fluffy, high-level conceptual stuff. And then you come to events like this and it's all, this is how you do unit testing, and here's how you do some technique in some language. And there's an interesting midpoint where these two worlds need to meet. So that's essentially why I did this talk.
What do you hope that people have taken away from your talk today?
The thing I hope people take away from my talk is that they need to think. Because we do a lot of cargo culting in our industry. You start out with a blank project in your IDE. How do we structure our code? Well, let's just do it this way because that's what we did last time and it kind of worked. I see lots of that going on. I see lots of people at conferences saying you should do this one way of doing things. I like ports and adapters because that's the best way we know how. And again, it's not necessarily the best approach. It's just a different approach. And all the approaches have trade-offs. So hopefully that's the thing I wanted to suggest to people today. You have a bunch of options. They all have different trade-offs. Choose something, do some thinking.